Welcome to another installment of Spotlight on Schools. We focus on the Rochester City School District. I'm your host, Jim Strauss. Tonight we're going to be talking about two issues that have a great effect on Rochester students. They are the Common Core and the lack of diversity in both Rochester and the surrounding county. I'm pleased to have returning to the program Mr. Dan Drmacich. Dan is a retired principal of the School Without Walls and the current chairman of the Coalition for Justice in Education. Dan, thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, first let's talk about the Common Core. It's a new set of national standards that establish what students should learn at each grade level, from kindergarten to 12th grade. According to an article in the Democrat and Chronicle by Tiffany Lanks, it's the first national effort to adopt standards that are consistent across the country. New York has been one of the first states to roll out the standards, along with the tests that go along with them. Now, on October 23rd, the Democrat and Chronicle printed a guest essay by Xerox CEO Ursula Burns supporting the Common Core. A few days later, you wrote a guest essay in which you said that this essay, and in your words, clearly demonstrated why corporate executives like Bill Gates, Eli Broad, and Ursula Burns should stay out of public education reform efforts. In general, can you give the reason why? Now, there are 5 parts of this that we're going to talk about in a minute, but in general, why did you say that?
Well, first of all, people like Ursula Burns, Bill Gates, and Eli Broad, it's actually pronounced.
Broad. Oh,
yes.
Thank you.
They don't have any experience in education. They weren't teachers, they don't have a degree in education, but yet they're somehow pontificating about what should be for kids when they should be relying upon national experts like curriculum specialists, professors of education, and of course teachers and principals. So that would be the first reason. They don't really have any experience. Secondly, they clearly demonstrate that they don't have any knowledge of educational research. All the things that they advocate, those 3 individuals plus Sam Walton of Walmart, tend to be things like charter schools, high-stakes standardized testing, national curriculum, privatization of education, that poverty is no excuse for students performing poorly on tests. All of these things are not consistent with the volumes of research that are out there. So that would be another piece. And then I guess lastly, I would say organization development expertise says that this is not the way you roll out reform, by coercing or extorting people to get into it for money. And that's essentially why we have Common Core, charter schools, and APPR.
Okay, let me seize on that word extortion. You object to 5 parts of her essay, and the first one says, where she said, in 45 states have voluntarily accepted Common Core. You react to that part first.
Yeah, I did, and I used the word extortion in quotation marks because essentially that's what happened, is that many of these states probably would not have agreed to get into Common Core, at least not the way it's been rolled out, had they had the opportunity to do it for the right reasons. But given the economic downturn at this time and the fact that schools were terminating the employment of many teachers, many administrators, they needed money if they wanted to maintain the same kind of human resources and physical resources as well. So the idea from Race to the Top money from Arne Duncan and the U.S. Department of Education was that you can compete for this money. Again, a business transaction. You can compete for it. The winners will get it, the losers get nothing. And, but if you win it, you have to agree to 3 things. One is that you will implement a national curriculum with high-stakes standardized testing called Common Core. 2, you will evaluate your teachers through the use of high-stakes standardized testing in terms of how well your kids do on the exams and how much they grow. And 3, in terms of, what's the third now? That, charter schools. Charter schools would have to be increased significantly in that state, and New York State increased it to 200 additional charter schools. So that was the extortion. That was, if you do it, you must agree to these things, which severely disrupt the educational process in New York State and all the other states that have agreed to it, as well as the fact that none of it is connected to research. And I guess third, I would go beyond disrupt.
You're up to 4th now, by the way.
Yeah, all right,
Okay.
but it's destructive It's destructive to kids, it's destructive to the teacher profession.
Okay. Next, now, this quote appeared as the teaser on the front page, and it made the readers think that you said this, but it was she that said this. The reason New York needs to use Common Core is that the United States ranks poorly. Nope, that's it. That's the wrong one. That's the next one. My bad. But here's what she said. The reason New York needs to use Common Core is that the United States ranks poorly on international tests.
Right. And that's another fallacy that many of the current reformers, I call them deformers at times, that they buy into that quote that the international tests are somehow indicative of poor performance of students in the United States, and that therefore we need to ramp up our education with more rigorous testing, harder standards, more testing, and a more stringent, restrictive curriculum. But the truth is, number one, there's no correlation by any research between that of economic growth of any country and test scores. There's no relationship between the two. It would seem, gee, you know, that there is a correlation, but there's not. And it's proven in the fact that during the Reagan years, during the Clinton years, when we had outstanding economic growth in the country, we still had those mediocre scores on international tests. And again, Japan, which at times has great economic growth, most recently in the new millennium, they had poor economic growth, but yet they were at the top in terms of international test scores. Now that's one reason. There's no research to prove that there's a correlation, but the second piece is even more dramatic and more interesting, because what it says is that if we were to disaggregate or take the 21% of our kids that live in poverty and take them out of the equation in terms of how well we do on international tests, we'd be at the top. There's a simple deduction that we would make from that, is that poverty is the real issue. It's not education in general. I mean, it's not to say, in my view, that education doesn't need dramatic reform, but in terms of test scores, all we need to do is look at the disaggregation of those students who live in concentrated poverty. Even if we were to take the top 15% of poverty or the top 10%, you'd see us up in the top 5 in those international comparisons. So those are the two major reasons.
Okay. The next quote is the one that appeared on the front page of the Democrat and Chronicle and was attributed to you, but you didn't say it. This is what Ms. Burns said. The way to correct poor educational performance by Rochester students is to raise the bar of expectations.
Yeah, I didn't say that. I was referring to Ms. Burns, and in fact, the next day, the Democrat and Chronicle made a clarification of that on page 2. So.
Tiny little print at the bottom of the page.
Yeah, tiny little print at the bottom of the page, but nevertheless, they acknowledged it. I think in general, most educators, most reformers don't have any problem with higher expectations, as long as they're appropriate, as long as they're meaningful, and as long as they're individualized or personalized. Higher standards. We don't have a problem with that. But the problem is that, again, in this one-size-fits-all, this mass production perspective of the corporate leaders like Burns and Gates, Walton, and Broad, is that one-size-fits-all, and that everybody at grade level must be at grade level, when research clearly says that's not the way kids and human beings are. They grow at different rates. They can't all be there at the same time. But yet, because we're going to measure them this way, many kids are left behind and labeled as failures and become turned off from school because of this constant emphasis on testing and standardization.
All right, the last point in your response was, she said, New York needs to continue to move forward with the Common Core implementation process. Your reply? Your response, rather?
Wrong train, wrong track, wrong direction in terms of Common Core. Anybody, and I'm so surprised that Ursula Burns, the CEO of a large company like Xerox, would say that you can create some complex organizational change without having the practitioners who are going to implement this directly involved in terms of creating that change? They weren't involved. If you're going to do it, you got to do it right. And that means you got to roll it back, you got to get teacher input, you've got to get principal input, input of the experts, the professors, and then pilot it in some districts around the state. See how it works. Work out the kinks, as opposed to trying to build the airplane as it's flying, as they often say. I mean, the other argument is that it's developmentally inappropriate in many cases. Again, the research says, and there were parent after parent and teacher after teacher who said, my kids can't do this. They're just not ready to do it, but yet we're forcing them to do it, we're testing them on it, and they're feeling horrible about it. The other thing, too, is that you'll hear the argument from all the supporters of Common Core, including John King again, that, well, these are going to test for the kind of skills that we need from kids in order to be successful college students, in order to be successful in careers, and to be good citizens. Things like critical thinking, rational decision-making, creative problem-solving, those types of things. Now, those things may be in the standards as Common Core has identified and delineated them. However, they're not tested for. You can't test for those things unless you do a performance-based test that would include evidence that the child or the student has applied those skills to the real world. And the only way you can see them is really in performances or presentations or projects that the student has done. So it would make much more sense. If that's what they're really saying they're after, then you've got to test for it appropriately. And that means a performance-based test, perhaps a portfolio of all the students' work, which could include teacher-made tests as well, homework, everything to show that the child is growing and developing toward those goals.
Well, we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the fact that although Monroe County is the 11th wealthiest county in the state, the city of Rochester has one of the highest child poverty rates in the country. How does that affect these children's education? We'll be right back. Welcome back to Spotlight on Schools. We're talking with Dan Drmacich, former principal of Rochester's School Without Walls and current chairman of the Coalition for Justice in Education. In the last segment, we talked about the Common Core. Now we're going to talk about the issue of segregation within Monroe County and how it affects the Rochester City School District. A recent study by the Civil Rights Project ranked Rochester 27th out of 381 metropolitan areas when it came to the separation of black and white students. I'm going to start with a quote from an October 31st Democrat and Chronicle article by Tiffany Lang. She said this: "Since race correlates closely with economic status, this racial separation drives a concentration of poverty in certain schools, a factor that research consistently shows is a prime indicator of academic performance." What she's stating essentially is that if you're a person of color in Rochester, chances are you're going to be poor. And if you're poor, chances are you're going to struggle in school. How do you react to that?
Well, I think in general it's on target. There are always the heroic individuals, I think that Jonathan Kozol points out in his book, Shame of the Nation, that do make it because they had something special going for them. They just happen to be in the right place at the right time to find somebody who's going to be supportive of them, or they just make it because they happen to have what it takes in order to do it, some type of internal fortitude to overcome all the negative conditions of poverty. But in general, for most kids, when I think about all the kids that I dealt with in Rochester over the past 40 years, until I retired in 2010, there are many kids who suffered from this intense conditions of concentrated poverty, whether it be from coming to school in the morning through drug and violent infested neighborhoods, from having poor prenatal conditions that they're not even aware of that existed with them in terms of a preterm birth. And we know from all the studies that poor prenatal care and prenatal births end up in terms of more problems with the student, not only in terms of more asthma, more physical conditions, medical conditions, but also behavioral problems in school. And there's other things that pertain to it as well in terms of nutrition, in terms of the parenting that students get if you only have one parent at home, the number of books that are in the home. I mean, on average, we find out that kids in the suburbs, when they come to their suburban kindergarten classes, they have a vocabulary of over 2,000 words. In Rochester, for kindergartners coming from poor backgrounds, it's around 500 words. They've even discovered that the way poor parents, and this is part of the parenting skill dilemma and problem, is that poor parents, when they read to kids, they ask different types of questions. It could be almost things like, who is this, where is he going, what's he going to do, as opposed to things like, who do you think Jimmy's most like in this story? What do you think might happen after he does that? Which are a little bit higher level thinking kinds of questions and more involvement for the student or for the child in terms of what they're reading. So there's all kinds of different factors that enter into this. And based on my experience, it's unfortunately predictable that many kids are going to have difficulty. And that's why we find so many after-school programs, so many test prep programs, so much of teaching to the test because students are having a difficult time adjusting to these expectations that they're not necessarily capable of at this time in their lives because of what they've gone through. Lead poisoning as well. I mean, an incredible determinant in terms of behavior and cognitive ability that is pretty much irreversible. And the experts on it, Ralph Spezio, currently the principal who came back to School 17, predicts that there's over 10,000 kids in Rochester in the city schools out of 30,000 who have significant levels of lead paint poisoning.
Oh, wow. Wow. Well, I'm stunned by that number.
Well, here's another piece for you. When Ralph, about 15 years ago, came to School 17, he instituted or actually worked on enough contributions from the community to build a $7 million health center at School 17. One of the first things that they did was tested all the preschool kids, there are over 150 of them, for lead paint poisoning. Out of the 150, what percentage do you think were infected with lead paint poisoning?
I'm afraid to guess.
100%. 100%.
And what action was taken?
Well, that's a good question because Ralph and other lead paint poisoning advocates in Monroe County and New York State have been fighting for more appropriate testing of kids. They don't realize, in many cases, many of the health systems or whatever, that when kids are even 2 or 3 crawling around on the floor, there's microscopic particles on their hands. They lick their hands or whatever, and it's ingested. So if you test a kid at birth versus that of 3 months later or 6 months later or a year later, it's going to have different results.
Wow. And that's just one aspect.
One aspect. And if you think for a moment in terms of having a class of 25 kids with one or more of these conditions in your classroom, and then other things like obesity and kids who have asthma and all of these things in one classroom, how is that fair? How is it fair to compare those kids to a group of middle-class kids who have all the advantages in the world from Pittsburgh or Webster or whatever? It isn't fair, and it demands that we follow the research and base kids' growth and development individually as opposed to in groups and compare them when we know that some groups have more advantages than others.
Okay, there was a recent article in the newspaper, actually it was a cover story, very consistent, very thorough article called Schools in Black and White. It was about segregation in the city, and it also about chronic poverty. Sometimes I'm a lot more comfortable talking about poverty in terms of concentrated poverty, and the measure being free and reduced lunch. That's easy to measure. But we're talking also, if we're talking about the inner city, that also is talking about minorities. Let me give you this statistic. I'm sure you're familiar with it. In Monroe County, about 61% of students are white. In Monroe County, I thought that percentage would have been higher. But there's been a lot of white people leaving. In some districts, between 2 and 22% have left. whether it be because they're able to, or because jobs have gone to other places, or because perhaps the birth rate has fallen, but 39% are minority. So that's about a 60-40% split. Only 4 of 18 districts fall within a plus or minus 5% of that 60 to 40 split. They are East Irondequoit, Gates Chili, Greece, and Rush Henrietta. Also, the Genesee Community Charter School fits that breakdown. The city of Rochester is near the bottom on that list. A percentage that hovers, I think, somewhere between 85 and 95%, depending on the school. Just ahead of Hilton and Honeoye Falls, Lima, which are almost all white. Lang's article said this: research suggests that 40% is the maximum number of poor students a school should have. Otherwise, the challenges connected to poverty start to overcome the system, making it more difficult for students to be successful. I've read quite a bit about this 40% number. Why 40%?
Well, I don't think it has anything to do with Rochester in terms of the
Oh, no.
breakdown at all.
But that's where we live.
Right,
so.
right. But it does have something to do with the experience that that's taken place in Wake County, North Carolina. Many years ago, perhaps 30 years ago, Wake County, despite the fact that they're in what many people say part of the Deep South, they had the vision to realize that if they were going to educate all their kids fairly and equitably, and also to prevent future problems in terms of more welfare, more incarceration, more failure, more dropouts, that they had to do something significant. In the book Hope and Despair in the American City by Gerald Grant, Grant details this in terms of a comparison of Syracuse, which is almost a mirror of Rochester, to that of Wake County in terms of the kind of schools that they have there and the parent satisfaction with them. Now, despite the fact that their schools are not by any means utopia, the truth is that they've got approximately a 90% parent satisfaction rate with those schools. And in those schools, they guarantee, or at least their goal is, that they do not want to have any more than 40% of any of the kids living in poverty, and a 60% middle class and up breakdown. As a result of this, they've shown no significant difference in terms of the 60%, which are primarily white students, learning any less than what they did before, and significant gains with minorities in terms of blacks and Hispanics. In some cases, it's not perfect, but what they're doing is using magnet schools, incentives to students to attend schools in order to break down the high inappropriate numbers of white or poor versus affluent students. And what they found to have is significant results as a result. So the number 40 is basically based on their research. There may be more out there that I'm not aware of, but I know Wake County has been kind of a gold standard, so to speak, in terms of what could be done.
One of the reasons that I've also read some information about that study, is that in a classroom, if 40% are poor and haven't perhaps developed good habits within a classroom, that the 60% tend to model for those 40% good habits. They tend to come in with their homework done.
Right. It's what I believe James Coleman stated in the old Coleman Report, which was written back in the late 60s during LBJ's war on poverty, is that they called this social capital. That there are things that are kind of the hidden curriculum that may be even more important than the given curriculum that you have, that becomes real important for kids. I mean, things like kids suddenly realizing that, oh, gee, I didn't know that there was prep classes for SAT. You know, I just never heard of that before in the school that I went to before, but now there is. Maybe observing middle-class behavior in terms of how people meet and greet each other, and you know, how you create networking. You know, that, you know, there's always this, you know, what some people label as the old boys network, you know, and learning about that and how to make connections, those types of things that become very critical in terms of social capital. Perhaps we need other alternatives. Perhaps we need a complete change of the curriculum. Perhaps we need a change in pedagogy in terms of how we approach kids and how we deal with kids. Perhaps we need, which is probably the biggest thing, is smaller class sizes. And there are many people now who would, in terms of class size, who would say what we really need are class sizes of about 12 to 1 in those poor urban districts and even rural districts as well, in order to reach kids, in order to spend more time with them, in order to have them connect with not only the teacher but other students and learn from one another. So class size is critical, and I think that could probably make more difference than anything else. You can look at Monroe High School near Monroe Avenue and Alexander Street with a population of about 95% black and Hispanic students, and 3 miles down the road in Brighton, you've got a school that's probably 95% white. There's something inequitable and unfair about that, given the resources that exist at the other school. And I guess, as the Supreme Court justices said, there's something inherently wrong and unequal about that as well.
There was a reference in one of these stories to a court case that came up around 10 years ago. It was called the Painter case. About 10 years ago, on the Painter case, plaintiffs claimed that the state's school district boundaries isolated children in the Rochester schools, and that isolation became the main cause of their academic troubles. The case was ultimately dismissed, but a woman who brought that up said, "You have a new judge and a new context." She went on to say, and this woman who's saying this is, her name is U of R Associate Professor Kara Finnegan. She says, you need a judge, a legislator, a district superintendent, or an activist who's pushing it and never, ever backing down.
Right. Yeah, unfortunately, it's almost like the political kiss of death when either superintendents, board members, or someone like Bill Johnson proposes to Monroe County, and people are afraid. They're scared to death that something's going to go wrong.
In this Schools in Black and White, it mentioned a recent Unite Rochester poll where county residents were asked if Monroe County should have a county-wide school district, and almost half said yes. Now, it makes sense that the city, 70% are going to say yes because they stood to gain. But in the county, about 45% said yes and only 48% said no. Now, Tiffany Lanks, the author of the article, suggested that the results were driven by economic concerns. For example, the idea of consolidating costs may appeal as school districts struggle for funding. Nevertheless, I was surprised by that willingness.
I am too, and I guess it's a pleasant surprise for whatever reason. I would hope it's motivated somewhat by compassion and altruism, but that may not be the case. I would think that there are more people who are beginning to realize that I think we do need to be more fair and equitable with our taxes and with our school systems, especially because, I mean, the other issue with economics is you're either going to pay now for it in terms of higher taxes to help these kids, even if it means, you know, doubling our taxes to have class sizes of 12 to 1, or you're going to pay for it later in terms of more welfare, more incarceration of people, more dropouts. It's either now or later, and why not do it now?
Well, a stimulating conversation. I want to thank you, Dan, for joining us today. We've been talking with Dan Drmacich, former principal of School Without Walls and current chairman of the Coalition for Justice in Education. You've been watching Spotlight on Schools. Thanks for watching. Good night.